So, we've been studying about the New Covenant Church, and we see that they met in small groups of equals, and everyone could minister, everyone could teach, and the most important function was the gospel. Now, what happened? That's the way the Christians were meeting in the times of the Bible. What happened after the times of the Bible? Where did Christianity go? Well, the next couple hundred years after the end of the recorded time in the Bible are kind of a dark age. And I personally would not, and many historians are we're not sure of everything that happened to the church during that period of time. It's very hard to find records that are accurate or be sure of things. You'd be surprised at how much Christian churches of today are actually relying on people during that time, that period of dark age when we don't know what was going on. I'll talk about that later maybe. But what we can believe is that many Christians were continuing in the apostleship and of the New Covenant way of meeting and functioning. At the same time, just like the Christians in the Bible, they were being heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire, the kings of the Gentiles that Jesus warned about a number of times. The Roman Empire persecuted Jesus, persecuted the Christians in the Bible. They were the rulers of the world at that time. They controlled the biggest empire. They controlled Israel and most of the countries around the Mediterranean. So they were the rulers at that time, and they didn't like Christians. They didn't like Christianity. What's interesting, and what's a very important point, is that the Christians during that period of time, it's the period of time, the cliche, the Christians being thrown to the lions. But that wasn't a cliche, that was true. Now imagine the folks of that era. Just imagine, put yourself in that position. Here they were meeting, and to be a Christian was illegal. You could get sent to jail or get executed or thrown to the lions for doing it. And yet at the same time, by practicing the apostleship that they were doing in the New Testament, by practicing and continuing and meeting in small groups, going out and witnessing the gospel to people, Christianity was growing under the greatest persecution that Christians have ever faced. I mean, I don't think Christians ever have faced such a hard persecution as the Roman Empire put on them, and yet Christianity was growing and spreading. I think that testifies to the effectiveness of the method in the New Testament. Okay? And that's a very important point, and that's a point they don't need to study history about. That's just a fact. We know that Christianity was spreading and growing. Now, there were a couple of things that we do know, or we have a pretty good idea that the Romans were doing also. And one of those things is they used to actually destroy the New Covenant when they got a hold of it. In other words, when they caught a group of Christians, if they found them with a letter from Paul or a Gospel of Mark or Matthew, they were burning it. They were destroying it. Okay? So it's believed, and this is a theory, and there's some historical facts to support this, so I just put this out to you as a theory or an idea, that it's believed that some Christians during this period of time, in the next couple hundred years of Christians, 2nd and 3rd century, some Christians may have gotten a little bit separated from the New Covenant. They didn't have too much of the New Covenant to deal with. On the other hand, the Old Covenant was available to them. Why was that? Well, that was because Israel was still a nation, and the Romans knew if they went and destroyed the Torah, Israel would rise up and have have battle with them and fight them, and there would be a lot of trouble if they did that. The Christians weren't a nation, so they felt free to try to destroy the Holy Scriptures in the New Testament. They couldn't do it, though. The Christians kept spreading the word and preserving the New Covenant documents. But at the same time, it's believed, and this is only conjecture, but there's some facts to support this, that some Christians started getting turned back to the Old Covenant practices. They saw the Jewish synagogue system, and maybe some Christians in certain areas began to practice the Old Covenant way of meeting, whereby they just had one or two people, one person who was in ministry, like the Levitical priesthood and so on, and most of the people would sit and listen to teaching from and then they started meeting in larger groups and not focusing so much on the gospel, but mostly on teaching one another and so on. And so some of those practices from the Old Covenant may have started to creep into Christianity during this period of time, partly due, I believe, to the Roman persecution. Now, in the 4th century, and this is the area that most of the Reformation of the church happened, and it's an amazing period to study, and it's very well recorded history. There was an emperor named Constantine. Now, I'm sure maybe you've read about him, but just to review what he did. Constantine was an emperor, and like the other emperors, he was the god above all gods. He believed himself to be above Christianity, but at the same time, he did an unusual thing. He turned the policy of the Roman Empire 180 degrees around and said that it's okay or legal to be a Christian. Whether he became a Christian or not is debatable, whether he truly believed in Christianity, whether this was completely political. It's very hard for people to put their finger on the whys of it, and I'm not going to try to do that. The fact is, he did do this, though. He did turn the policy around and make it legal to be a Christian. Now, again, I want to put myself in the position of the Christians in that day. Think about it. They had been persecuted for a couple hundred years, severely. I'm sure during that time they were praying to God, Lord, end this persecution, help us, save us from these Romans. And perhaps it seemed like their prayers were answered when Constantine suddenly said, it's legal to be a Christian, we're not going to persecute you anymore. They must have been running to God and saying, thank you, God. They must have been very happy at that time, I'm sure. They didn't realize what would happen next, because what did happen next, and again, this is very well recorded history, is that Constantine and some of the Roman emperors that followed him especially, but Constantine sat down in a council with certain Christian people who were chosen as leaders all of a sudden, and those few sat down in a council and started to reform the church and started to make up new rules for how the church would work. Now, this process carried on over the period of years. There was another Roman emperor. His name was Theodosius III, I believe, and he was in power shortly after Constantine, and he did another step. And it was a strange step, and it's probably the strangest thing that has ever happened in Christianity or in the world. But what he did was, he went the next step, and he made the Christian religion the only official religion of Rome. Now, what did that mean? Well, that meant because he was the God above all gods, he could choose what religion the whole country was going to be in, the whole empire. And he said, now everybody's a Christian. Now, you can't just declare everyone a Christian, but he did that. So what happened in reality was, suddenly, and I know that I read in a Catholic history book, and the quote from that was very, very interesting. They said this. They said, simple apostleship was no longer needed. Well, number one, that made sense, didn't it? They didn't need to keep going out and meeting in small groups and witnessing the gospel like they had been doing. Everybody was already a Christian, supposedly. They said this, new forms of ministry had to be invented. The care and registration of all these unrepentant people had to be taken care of. So now, get the picture of what happened. Here's the Christians, and suddenly, whoa, the Roman emperor has declared everyone a Christian. What are we going to do? Well, at that time, the emperor took the pagan basilicas, which were temples, the pagan temples, and more or less gave them to Christians and said, go ahead and teach the Christians. And what they came up with, the way they reformed the church, the new form of ministry they invented, was the Mass, the church service. The church service originally was created to teach pagans to be Christians. In other words, now get the picture. You took over the pagan temple. The Christians were up on the altar. You marched all the pagans in once a week. They literally used to put a guard at the door. In fact, some Catholic churches, I saw a film, an older film of some Catholic, ancient Catholic churches, and they had a guard posted at the door. Why would they have a guard posted at the door? Well, it was because they literally, in the old days, they had to force people to go into this building once a week and be taught Christianity. So the Christians were up on the altar trying to preach, and they put a pulpit. The pulpitum is a Roman invention. That was something the emperors and the senators would use to give speeches. Well, they put that into the basilica, and they would try to preach to these unrepentant, unsaved people who were now supposedly forced to become Christians. It's an interesting thing. That's what they invented. And you know what? Maybe that was the right thing to do back then. I'm not saying it was wrong. But it did happen. Now, what happened after that was, and I remember reading this also in this Catholic history book, at that time, the people who were the leaders in Christianity, these chosen bishops, now became the idea that they were now the leaders in Christianity, and eventually the Bishop of Rome became the Pope and so on. But there were these bishops, and that's the way the Roman government worked. They Christian church into the Roman government, so to speak, those people started giving. It said, the quote, the history book said that the leaders of that day were probably amazed and a little confounded that the rules they now became Roman law. So the people at that day and age were making, and these councils were making rules, and they literally became law throughout the whole world and throughout the Roman Empire, enforced by all the force of the Roman Empire. So Christianity took on a whole different spirit, a whole different function, a whole different definition of ministry for sure, and authority. So now all of a sudden the minister was in authority over the congregation. And the picture that they had gone to, which maybe they were influenced by the Old Testament, and I believe they started reaching back at the Old Testament to look for rules to follow and so on. And so now all of that became the picture of the church. Certain pagan beliefs started coming into the church, but I'm not interested in that. I'm mainly interested in the definition of ministry and function and how things happened at that time. And if you look at what happened in the 4th century, that's when the church service, the Mass, was invented, and it was invented to control pagans. Again, go back to Luke chapter 22, verse 25 and 26. Jesus talks about the kings of the Gentiles who exercise authority one over another, and he said, "Not so among you." Now, 3 times Jesus warned of these Gentile princes, or them that are accounted to rule over the Gentiles. Certainly those were the Roman emperors. The truth is that a couple hundred years after Jesus spoke those words of warning about not making ministry into authority over others and not operating through that system, well, the Roman Empire joined itself to the church, influenced the church, and it's been literally remade the definition of ministry and authority and remade the system of operation. So there's been a huge influence from the kings of the Gentiles on the church, and it's quite apparent in history, and I can only suggest that you study it for yourself.